The stench of the FBI's Paranormal Division is a cocktail of ozone, stale coffee, and the wet, metallic rot of things that should have stayed buried. My desk lamp flickered, a dying pulse in a room where shadows didn't just fall, they pulled like spilled ink on a cracked linoleum floor. I've spent 30 years hunting the things that shouldn't exist, and my reward was a desk in a basement office and a mandatory retirement letter that felt more like a death warrant. I was 2 weeks away from a pension and a life without nightmares, or so I told myself while the static in my ears grew louder every time I closed my eyes. Every year on the job is another layer of filth on the soul, a film of grey grime that no amount of scotch or silence can ever truly wash away. The flickering fluorescent tubes overhead hummed a funeral dirge, a jagged sound that vibrated deep in my teeth. Then the folder hit my desk. It was heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of stagnant water and old, sun-bleached plastic. It didn't just carry information, it carried a weight that made the wood of my desk groan. I didn't need to open it to know it was the kind of case that leaves scars on the air itself. Agent Elena Brooks stood in the doorway, her silhouette cutting through the low-key amber glow of the hallway. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked in with a stride that suggested she'd already made peace with whatever ghost was waiting for her in the void. She was young, her movements sharp and jagged, but her eyes were twin pits of cold determination. I knew that look. It's the look of someone who has been haunted by a single, screaming question for 28 years, a question that usually ends in a shallow grave or a padded cell. Her presence brought the smell of rain and cold iron into the room, cutting through the stagnant rot of my office. "Oregon," she said, her voice a low rasp that grated against the oppressive silence. Blackwood Mall. The name sent a spike of ice through my marrow, a cold needle piercing the very center of my chest. Blackwood was a black hole on the Bureau's map, a localized tear in the fabric of the mundane. Since 1996, 12 civilians and 4 field agents had gone into that concrete tomb and never come out. No bodies, no forensic traces, no blood spatter, just empty corridors, the smell of burnt rubber, and the persistent, low-frequency hum of a building that refused to die even after the power was cut decades ago. It was a place where the rules of geometry and mercy didn't apply. "Why you, Brooks?" I asked, my voice sounding like gravel being ground into an open wound. I tried to keep my hands steady, but the tremor was there, a rhythmic twitching born of 1,000 near misses with the afterlife. "Because my mother was the last person to lock the security gates on the night it went dark," she replied. Her eyes didn't blink. They were fixed on the folder like it was a predator about to strike. She never came home, Elias. They found her keys in the ignition of her car in the parking lot. The engine was still running. The heater was on full blast, screaming into an empty cabin. But she was gone. Just gone. She took a breath, and I could see the void behind her ribs. "I requested this. I requested you." I flipped open the file. The photos inside were grainy, bleeding with digital noise and a sickly, yellow-green shadow that seemed to move if you looked at it too long. The mall was a cathedral of rot, a monument to a world of consumerism that had been replaced by something much older and infinitely more hungry. Long, hollow concourses lined with shattered glass that looked like jagged teeth. Escalators that resembled the ribcage of giant, prehistoric beasts rotting in the desert. And the mannequins. Even in the low-resolution surveillance stills, they looked fundamentally wrong. They weren't posed for fashion. They were caught in mid-gesture, their smooth, featureless plastic faces turned toward the camera, their limbs twisted into angles that defied human anatomy and basic physics. They looked like they were imitating a species they despised. "The Bureau calls them mimetic transfer vessels," I muttered, the words feeling like hot bile in the back of my throat. "I call them parasites. They feed on observation. They live in the corner of your eye, in the agonizing spaces between heartbeats. They are the static on your television when the signal fails. They wait for you to blink, and in that millisecond of darkness, they move closer." Brooks leaned over the desk, her face inches from mine in the flickering light. "I requested you, Elias. You're the only one who's ever come back from a grade 5 manifestation with your mind intact. I don't want a partner. I don't want someone to hold my hand. I want a guide who knows how to walk through the fire without becoming fuel." I looked at the retirement letter, then at the shadows dancing in the corners of my office. The darkness here felt thin tonight, like a veil ready to tear under the weight of a heavy thought. In Blackwood, the darkness would be thick enough to drown in, a physical weight that would press the air from our lungs. I knew this wasn't just a final assignment. It was a summons from the abyss itself. The mall had been waiting for us, breathing in the silence of the Oregon woods, growing fat on the memories and the marrow of the missing. The apprehension wasn't a sudden flicker of fear. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. My hand shook as I reached for my gear bag, the leather cracked and worn like my own tired skin. We weren't just going to investigate a haunting. We were stepping into a throat that was already beginning to swallow. I could feel the mall's influence even here, miles away, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck like 1,000 plastic fingers brushing against my hair. "Check your UV lights," I told her, my voice barely a whisper against the hum of the overhead fluorescence that seemed to be dimming with every passing second. "And Brooks, if you see your mother in there, if you hear her calling your name from the dark of the food court, you don't answer. You don't look back. You run until your lungs bleed." She didn't answer. She just stared at the map of the mall, her fingers tracing the jagged path to the basement. The shadows in the room seemed to lean toward her, eager and hungry for the light she still carried. My final assignment wasn't about closure or justice. It was about surviving a place where the air tasted like static and the walls were made of teeth. We were headed into the gut of a monster, and I was terrified that I wouldn't have the strength to kill it before it finished its meal. The mall didn't just feel empty. It felt hollowed out, like a carcass left to bleach in the sun, only there was no sun here. Just the heavy, oppressive Oregon dampness and a silence so thick it felt like it was trying to crawl into my ears. My flashlight beam was a pathetic, flickering needle stitching through a veil of dust and oily shadows. Beside me, Elena was a silhouette of jagged nerves. Her breath hitched every time the floorboards groaned under our boots, a rhythmic, wet sound that reminded me of a heartbeat. She was looking for her mother. I was looking for a way to survive the next 12 hours. We found the security hub on the second level, tucked behind a department store where the racks were still filled with moldering coats that looked like hanging bodies. The air inside the office tasted like ozone and copper, old blood and ancient static. It was there, amidst the shattered monitors and the smell of wet paper, that we found him. Or what was left of him. Dr. Julian Vance hadn't died easily. The office was a fortress of desperation, the door reinforced with heavy iron bars and the windows painted over with thick, black tar. Vance was slumped over a desk, his skin a parchment of grey decay, his fingers still clutching a leather-bound journal. I pried it from his frozen grip. The paper was brittle, the ink bleeding into the fibers like a spreading bruise. It wasn't just a log, it was a map of a nightmare. Vance called them mimetic transfer vessels, mannequins. But they weren't plastic and wire. They were something else, something birthed in the void between dimensions that used our own likeness as a lure. Elena's light shook as she shone it on the wall. There were dozens of them. Mannequins stood in the hallway just outside the glass, their faces smooth and featureless, their limbs frozen in mid-stride. They hadn't been there when we walked in. I could feel the paranoia rising in my throat, a bitter, cold lump of lead. My flashlight flickered, dying for a second, and when the light returned, they were 3 inches closer. They didn't move when we looked at them. They waited for the blink. They waited for the shadow. Vance's handwriting became a jagged scrawl on the final pages, the words etched so deep they nearly tore the paper. He had written them in bold, frantic strokes, the rules of survival. He knew the Bureau wouldn't send help in time. He knew he was already a ghost. Rule number 1, cover all mirrors before dark. Vance wrote that the glass wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway for the vessels to synchronize with your pulse. If they could see you, they could become you. I looked at the dark, polished surface of a nearby vending machine and felt a cold shiver race down my spine. We didn't have much time. The sun was dipping below the Oregon tree line, and the mall was swallowing what little grey light remained. Rule number 2, never follow familiar voices. Vance described hearing his wife calling from the ventilation shafts, even though she had been dead for a decade. The entities didn't just mimic the body, they harvested the echoes of your grief. They were psychic scavengers, picking through the trash of your memory to find the one sound that would make you turn around. Elena's face went pale. I knew she was thinking about her mother. I could see the desperate, warring emotions in her eyes, the need to find her and the terror of what she might find instead. Rule number 3, never enter the basement initially. The basement was the gut. The prime was there, Vance said. The source of the static. If you went down before the cycle was complete, you weren't just dying, you were volunteering for the harvest. I looked at Elena. Her flashlight beam caught a mannequin standing just outside the door. It was wearing a dark jacket, almost identical to hers. Its posture was a perfect, sickening mirror of the way she held her shoulders when she was tired. It wasn't just a doll anymore. It was a sketch of her, a rough draft of a replacement. The paranoia turned into a physical weight, pressing against my chest. Every shadow was a limb. Every crack in the floor was a mouth. We started grabbing whatever we could find: old posters, tarps, duct tape. We had to cover the glass. We worked in a frantic, silent rhythm, our flashlights cutting through the dark in violent arcs. Every time I turned my back, I felt the air shift. I felt the heat of something standing just behind me, a presence that smelled of old plastic and ozone. When I spun around, there was nothing but the mannequins, their blank faces staring into the void, their hands reaching out in a frozen, mocking plea. The static in the air grew louder, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my teeth. It was the sound of the mall waking up. We were in the belly of the beast, and the digestive juices were starting to flow. I looked at the journal one last time before stuffing it into my tactical vest. Vance had left a final note, scribbled in the margin of the last page, almost illegible. It said, "They don't want your blood. They want your place." I checked my watch. 6 p.m. The darkness was absolute now, held back only by our failing batteries. The mall was no longer a building. It was a predatory organism, and we were the foreign cells it was determined to absorb. I could hear a faint sound coming from the hallway, a dry, rhythmic scraping, like sandpaper on stone. The mannequins were moving. Not fast, not yet. They were just repositioning, finding the angles where our lights didn't reach. Elena gripped her sidearm, her knuckles white. I could see the sweat beading on her forehead in the harsh, blue light of her lead. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was haunted by the possibility that her mother's voice was waiting for her in the dark. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but the lie tasted like ash. I knew the rules, and I knew the cost of breaking them. The first mimicry started small. A soft whisper that sounded like my name, drifting from the back of the security office. I ignored it, focused on taping a piece of heavy cardboard over a cracked mirror on the wall. But the voice didn't stop. It grew more insistent, more melodic. It started to sound like my ex-wife, the one I hadn't spoken to in years. It was the exact cadence of her laugh, the one she used right before she told me she loved me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. "Don't listen," I hissed, more to myself than to Elena. "It's just the static. It's just the mall." But the static was getting louder, a roar of white noise that seemed to be coming from the very walls. The flashlights began to strobe, the beams dying and surging in time with the thumping in my ears. In the flashes of light, the mannequins in the hall were closer. One was at the door now. Its plastic fingers were curled around the frame, the material looking soft, almost like flesh, where it touched the wood. It was wearing Elena's jacket. It had her height. It had her stance. The paranoia was a fever now. I found myself checking the corners every 5 seconds, terrified that I'd see one of them standing inside the room with us, having slipped in during a heartbeat of darkness. The rules were the only thing holding the madness back. Cover the mirrors. Ignore the voices. Stay out of the basement. We retreated to the center of the room, standing back to back. The harsh, flickering light created a perimeter of safety that felt dangerously thin. Outside, the scraping sounds grew more frequent, a cacophony of plastic limbs dragging across the tile. They were circling us, testing the boundaries of our resolve. I looked at the covered mirrors, the duct tape straining against the pressure of something trying to push through from the other side. The glass was humming. The mall wanted us to see. It wanted us to look into the reflection and realize that the things outside were more real than we were. Elena leaned her head back against mine. Her voice was a jagged whisper. "Elias, what if my mother is really down there? What if she's waiting?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I spoke, I was afraid I'd hear her mother's voice coming out of my own mouth. The mimetic transfer was beginning. The air felt thick, like we were breathing in liquid plastic, our lungs slowly being coated in the same substance that made up the horrors outside. I checked the tone generator on my belt, the UV lights ready, the sledgehammer heavy at my side. We were prepared for a fight, but this wasn't a war of attrition. It was a war of the mind. The rules weren't just instructions, they were an anchor. As long as we followed them, we were still human. The moment we doubted, the moment we let the paranoia win, we were just more raw material for the mall to shape. A sudden, sharp bang echoed from the basement door down the hall. Then, a scream. It was high, piercing, and unmistakably human. It was the sound of a woman being torn apart. Elena lunged forward, but I caught her arm, my grip bruising. "No," I growled. Rule number 2. Never follow the voices. "But it sounds just like her, Elias," Elena cried, her eyes wide and wild in the flickering light. "It's the mall," I said, my voice sounding hollow and strange in my own ears. "It's the static. It's not your mother. It's a hook. Don't let it catch you." We stood there in the suffocating dark, the screaming continuing, building into a crescendo of agony that vibrated in our very bones. I closed my eyes, picturing the mannequins outside, their featureless faces twisted into a silent, mocking imitation of grief. They were learning. They were perfecting the art of the lure. And the night was only just beginning. The silence that followed the scream was worse than the sound itself. It wasn't a natural quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a void waiting to be filled. The air in our makeshift sanctuary, a boarded-up jewelry store, tasted of stale copper and the chemical rot of aged foam. Outside the shuttered gates, the mall breathed. It was a slow, rattling aspiration that vibrated through the floorboards, a rhythmic grinding of plastic limbs against polished linoleum. Elena stood by the back wall, her hands white-knuckled around her service weapon. The cold blue moonlight filtered through the high, cracked skylights of the atrium, casting long, jagged daggers of obsidian across the floor. We were surrounded by darkness that felt alive, a thick, viscous ink that seemed to swallow the meager beam of my flashlight. I checked the duct tape on the mirrors for the 3rd time. Dr. Vance's journal was clear. The glass is a doorway, and they don't need it open to step through. They just need you to look. A wet, sliding sound echoed from the corridor. It was the sound of a heavy weight being dragged, followed by the sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of hard resin on tile. I peered through a narrow slit in the plywood boarding. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. There, bathed in that ghostly lunar glow, stood one of them. It wasn't just a mannequin. It was an insult to the human form. Its skin was a sickly, translucent white, like the belly of a deep-sea fish, and it stood in a posture that was hauntingly familiar. It had the same slight hunch in the shoulders, the same defensive tilt of the head as Elena. It wore a dark, heavy jacket that looked as though it had been flayed from the shadows themselves. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It simply existed in the space where Elena should have been, a static monument to our impending obsolescence. The mimicry was offensive. It was a psychic parasite, peeling back the layers of our identity to see what made us flinch. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. This was how they hunted. They didn't just kill you. They replaced the idea of you until there was nothing left but a hollow shell and a fading memory. "Elena, Elias," the voice whispered. It didn't come from the hallway. It came from the air itself, a shimmering distortion of sound that felt like sandpaper on my eardrums. It was her mother's voice. It wasn't a perfect recreation. It had the tinny, distorted quality of an old tape loop, layered with a sickening wetness, as if the words were being pushed through a throat filled with stagnant water. "Help me, Elena. It's so dark. The mirrors, they are so cold." Elena's breath hitched. She took a step toward the door, her eyes glazed with a desperate, agonizing hope. I grabbed her arm, my fingers digging into her sleeve. Her skin felt like ice. "Stay focused, Brooks," I hissed, my voice a jagged rasp in the dark. "That's not her. It's the static. It's just the mall talking." She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the fracture in her resolve. Her grief was a wound that hadn't healed in 28 years, and the entities were jamming their plastic fingers right into the center of it. "I'm so tired, Elena," the voice continued, rising in volume, cracking with a simulated sob. "Why did you leave me in the basement? I can feel them looking at me. They have my eyes, Elena. They're using my eyes to watch you." The sound began to warp. The pitch shifted, sliding down into a guttural, subsonic growl that made the glass display cases rattle in their frames. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and wet earth. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. The middle of the graveyard shift, where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the plastic was at its thinnest. Suddenly, the scratching began. Not on the door, but on the walls. Dozens of them. The mimetic vessels were circling, their limbs clicking and snapping as they adjusted their forms. I could hear the sound of their featureless faces pressing against the wood, a dry, papery friction that set my teeth on edge. They were learning our scents, our heartbeats, the specific frequency of our fear. Then, the voice changed again. This time, it wasn't the mother. "Elias, open up. It's me." The voice was identical to Elena's. Every inflection, every sharp intake of breath, every nuance of her Oregonian accent was captured with terrifying precision. It came from directly outside the door, not 3 feet from where I stood. "I'm hurt, Elias. There's something wrong with my arm. It feels like it's turning to stone. Please, I need the kit." I looked at the real Elena standing beside me. She was silent, her mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes fixed on the door with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't even moving. The thing outside was a perfect sonic twin, a vocal doppelganger crafted from the void. "Don't listen," I whispered, more to myself than to her. The first rule of survival in the mall: never follow the familiar voices. They lead to the basement before you're ready. They lead to the mirrors. The door handle began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. The metal groaned under the pressure of a grip that wasn't human. A mannequin's hand has no give. It is a solid block of mold despair. The wood of the doorframe began to splinter, fine shards of pine spraying into the room like frozen sparks. "I know you're in there, Elias," the fake Elena said, her voice now devoid of emotion, flat and dead as a dial tone. "I can see your shadow through the cracks. You're looking at the wrong me." The psychic pressure hit us then, a wave of pure, concentrated misery that felt like a physical blow to the chest. It was the collective weight of every person who had ever vanished in this rotting cathedral of commerce. I felt my knees buckle. Images flashed behind my eyelids, rows of featureless faces, endless hallways of shattered glass, and the sight of my own body, frozen in a display window, wearing a suit I hadn't bought yet, staring out at a world I no longer belonged to. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. The pain anchored me. I reached out and grabbed the tone generator from my belt, cranking the dial to a high-frequency burst. The device emitted a piercing, crystalline shriek that cut through the psychic static like a razor. Outside, there was a chorus of dry, rattling hisses. The pressure eased. The scratching on the wall stopped. Through the gap in the plywood, I saw the silhouettes retreating into the obsidian shadows of the main concourse. They moved with a strange, stuttering gait, like a film with missing frames. "We are okay," I breathed, my heart finally slowing its frantic pace. We held the line. Elena didn't answer. She was staring at the floor, where the blue moonlight illuminated a single, pale object that had been slid under the door during the assault. It was a Polaroid photograph, yellowed and curled at the edges. It showed a woman in a security uniform, standing in front of a fountain that had been dry for decades. Her face was smiling, but her eyes were wrong. They were flat. They were silver. And in the background, reflected in a nearby shop window, was the silhouette of a small girl reaching out for a hand that wasn't there. The night was far from over. The mall wasn't just trying to kill us. It was trying to fold us into its history, to make us part of the permanent collection. I looked at the dark corridor leading toward the escalators, the path that led down into the gut of the building. The basement was calling, and the mimicry had been the invitation. The rules kept us alive, but they were a cage of our own making. We were surrounded by 1,000 hollow eyes, waiting for us to blink, waiting for the moment our discipline crumbled under the weight of the rotting air. I gripped the sledgehammer, the cold steel a grim promise of the violence to come. We had survived the night shift, but the true descent was about to begin, and the things in the dark were no longer content with just watching. They were ready to become us. The descent into the basement was not a walk down a flight of stairs. It was a slow, agonizing crawl into the gullet of a dying beast. The air down here did not move. It sat heavy and stagnant, a thick soup of particulate dust, dry rot, and the sharp, ozone sting of something ancient and electrical. Every step we took on the rusted iron catwalk echoed with a hollow, metallic clang that seemed to travel miles into the darkness before being swallowed whole. I could feel the weight of the mall pressing down on us, millions of tons of concrete and failed dreams resting on our shoulders. The red emergency lighting flickered in a rhythmic, dying pulse, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like fever dreams against the weeping concrete walls. It was the color of a fresh bruise, a dim, arterial crimson that turned the world into a landscape of blood and ink. Elena walked beside me, her movements stiff, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps that cut through the silence like a saw through bone. I could see the sweat glinting on her forehead in the strobe-like flashes of the red light. She wasn't just an agent anymore. She was a woman walking into her own nightmare, the culmination of 28 years of searching for a ghost. My hand was a claw around the handle of the sledgehammer, the cold steel biting into my palm, a blunt instrument of reality in a place that had long ago abandoned the laws of physics. The mall didn't want us here. It felt as though the very walls were contracting, the narrow hallways of the basement tightening like a throat preparing to swallow. We reached the bottom of the final stairwell and the space opened up into a cavernous storage bay. The scale of it was staggering, a subterranean void filled with the skeletal remains of old shelving units and crates that had long ago succumbed to the damp. But it wasn't the shadows that caught my eye. It was the light. In the center of the room, the red emergency lamps were being caught and magnified by a grotesque arrangement of glass. Dozens of tall, silver-backed mirrors had been dragged from the shops above and positioned in a tight, inward-facing circle. They were angled with mathematical precision, creating a feedback loop of reflections that stretched into infinity. The light bounced from one pane to the next, weaving a web of crimson lines that shimmered with an unnatural, oily luster. It looked like a ritual site, a cathedral built of vanity and static. Elena stopped so abruptly I nearly collided with her. Her flashlight beam trembled, cutting a swathe through the gloom until it landed on the center of the mirror circle. I felt my stomach lurch, a cold, oily sensation of pure, unadulterated shock washing over me. There were two figures in the center of the glass ring. The first was the Prime. It was a mimetic vessel, but it was unlike any of the hollow shells we had encountered on the floors above. This one was smooth, polished to a high, ivory sheen that looked more like bone than plastic. It had no face, yet it possessed a terrifyingly human posture, one hand raised in a delicate, almost maternal gesture. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its elongated limbs possessed of a grace that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It didn't just stand, it occupied the space with a predatory stillness, a void in the shape of a person. But it was the second figure that froze the blood in my veins. Standing directly beside the Prime, frozen in the same unnatural stasis, was a woman. She was wearing a tattered security guard's uniform, the fabric bleached of color by decades of darkness. Her skin was the color of parchment, pulled tight over a frame that looked fragile enough to shatter at a touch. Her hair, once dark like Elena's, had turned a ghostly, translucent white. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the mirrors in front of her, the pupils blown out until they were nothing but twin abysses of black. "Mom!" Elena's voice was a broken whisper, a sound so fragile it seemed to crack in the freezing air. The woman didn't respond. She was a statue of flesh and bone. But as I shifted my position, the red light hit the mirrors at a different angle, and the breath died in my throat. In the reflections, those infinite, recursive planes of silver, the woman was not still. The reflection of Elena's mother was screaming. I watched in horrific fascination as the woman in the glass hammered her fists against the inside of the mirror, her face contorted in a mask of primal terror. I could see the cords of her neck straining, her mouth open in a silent, eternal howl for help. But the woman standing in the center of the room, the physical body of Elena's mother, remained perfectly, deathly calm. Her face was a blank slate, her expression as empty as the mannequins surrounding us. It was a psychic vivisection. The entity hadn't just taken her, it had unspooled her. It had trapped her consciousness within the network of mirrors, using her physical body as a tether, a living battery to power the mall's growing consciousness. She was the anchor for the entire mimetic hive. Elena took a step forward, her hand reaching out into the red-stained air. The mirrors began to hum. It was a low, vibrating drone that set my teeth on edge and made the fluid in my inner ear boil. The sound grew louder, a chorus of 1,000 voices all screaming at a frequency just beyond human hearing. It was the sound of the void, the sound of the static between radio stations where the monsters live. "Look at her hands, Elias," Elena choked out, her voice thick with a grief that felt like a physical weight in the room. I looked. The woman's fingernails were gone, replaced by smooth, blunt tips of the same ivory material as the prime mannequin. The transition was happening. The skin of her forearms was beginning to take on that same polished, plastic sheen. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was being converted. The entity was slowly rewriting her biology, turning her into the ultimate mimetic vessel, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the hollow. The prime's head suddenly clicked to the side. It was a sharp, mechanical motion that echoed like a bone snapping. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze sweep over us, a cold, hungry pressure that made my skin crawl. The mirrors around it began to ripple, the silvered surfaces turning liquid. the reflections of the screaming woman blurring into a single, jagged smear of red. The shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard knot of professional fury. This was the source of the rot. This was the heart of the infection that had swallowed so many lives. The rules had warned us never to enter the basement initially, and now I knew why. This wasn't a placement for human eyes. It was a womb for something that shouldn't exist, a factory of mimicry and stolen souls. Elena was shaking, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the mirrors. Every time the light hit the glass, I saw more faces, agents who had gone missing, civilians who had wandered in and never wandered out. They were all there, trapped in the silver, their expressions frozen in various stages of realization and agony. They were the choir, and the prime was their conductor. I gripped the sledgehammer with both hands, the weight of it feeling like a sacred responsibility. The red light pulsed faster now, the emergency system sensing the intrusion, the mall's own nervous system screaming a warning to its master. The air grew colder, frost beginning to bloom in jagged patterns across the concrete floor. The smell of ozone became deafening, a metallic tang that filled my lungs until I felt like I was breathing needles. The entity in the center of the room began to speak. It didn't use a mouth, it used the mirrors. 1,000 different voices, 1,000 different tones, all speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. The sound didn't come from the air, it came from inside our own skulls. Leave the vessel, the voices droned, a dissonant chord of human sound. The daughter remains. The mother returns. A trade in the dark. Elena's mother's head tilted in perfect synchronization with the prime. A single tear, thick and grey like liquid plastic, rolled down her cheek. The shock was gone. Only the violence remained. I looked at the mirrors, seeing my own reflection, haggard, old, a man at the end of a long, dark road. I saw the sledgehammer in my hands, a jagged silhouette against the crimson glow. I looked at Elena, saw the devastation in her eyes, and then I looked at the thing that was wearing her mother like a cheap suit. The basement was a tomb, but I wasn't ready to be buried yet. I raised the hammer, the cold steel catching the red light like a dying star. The things in the dark were ready to become us, but they had forgotten one thing. We were the ones who brought the light, and light had a way of shattering everything it touched. The discovery was over. The confrontation had begun. The basement air didn't just smell like rot, it smelled like forgotten time, a thick, cloying soup of wet drywall, ozone, and the copper tang of old blood. Every step Elias and Elena took down those concrete stairs felt like descending into the throat of a dying god. The UV lights in our hands flickered, casting a rhythmic, strobing violet pulse that turned the world into a series of jagged, disconnected snapshots. It was like watching a film strip burn in real time. We were breathing through filters, but I could still taste the static on my tongue, a bitter, metallic film that made my teeth ache. Elena's hand was a vice on a floodlight, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged, panicked hitches that echoed against the weeping walls. We weren't just in the basement of an Oregon mall anymore. We were in the gut of the void. The mirrors were the first thing we saw. An inward-facing ring of them, tall and tarnished, their silver backing peeling away like burnt skin. They were arranged in a perfect, suffocating circle in the center of the dark expanse. And there, standing in the epicenter of that glass cage, was the thing that had haunted Elena's nightmares for nearly 3 decades. Her mother didn't look like a woman anymore. She looked like a sketch of a human drawn by someone who hated the medium. Her skin was the color of curdled milk, stretched so tight over her frame that it looked translucent, revealing no veins, no pulse, only a hollow, calcified stillness. Beside her stood the prime. It was taller than a man, its limbs elongated and multi-jointed, its face a smooth, featureless expanse of high-gloss porcelain that seemed to swallow the UV light rather than reflect it. It didn't move, yet I could feel its gaze, a pressure against the front of my skull, a psychic weight that made my vision blur into static. The tone generator on my belt hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my ribcage, meant to disrupt their frequency, but it felt like a needle scratching against a brick. The silence was broken not by a voice, but by a sound that mimicked a voice, a collage of 1,000 stolen whispers, stitched together into a jagged, discordant harmony. It came from the mother's throat, though her lips didn't move. It was the sound of a radio seeking a station between the cracks of reality. Elias, it said, or rather, it projected. The name felt like a cold blade sliding into my ear. A trade. Give us the new vessel. Give us the girl. The mother returns to the light. The daughter stays in the dark. Elena's breath hitched, a sob breaking through her mask. I saw her hand tremble, the UV light wavering, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like black flames against the mirrors. I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I spoke, I'd be letting them in. I tightened my grip on the sledgehammer, the heavy iron head feeling like a lead weight. The panic was a living thing now, a frantic bird trapped in my chest, beating its wings against my ribs. I looked at the first mirror. I saw my own reflection, but it wasn't me. It was a version of me with eyes like spilled ink, grinning a jagged, impossible grin. I swung. The impact was a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. The glass didn't just break, it screamed. A high-pitched, crystalline shriek tore through the basement, and for a second, the strobing UV light caught the shards as they sprayed through the air like frozen sparks. One. The moment the first mirror shattered, the mall above us woke up. It started as a low rumble, the sound of 10,000 plastic feet dragging across linoleum. They were coming. The vessels, the mimics, the things that lived in the corners of our vision. They were converging on the basement, a tide of artificial limbs and hollow chests. The prime mannequin's head tilted, a slow, mechanical click that sent a jolt of pure ice down my spine. Its porcelain face began to ripple, a sickening, fluid motion as it tried to stabilize its connection to the remaining 6 mirrors. Elena screamed, not a word, just a raw, guttural sound of terror as she swung her UV floodlight toward the stairwell. The purple light caught the first wave, dozens of them, their bodies contorted, their faces blank and terrifyingly expectant. They froze in the light, caught in mid-stride, a forest of pale, frozen limbs. Smash the next one, Elias, Elena choked out, her voice cracking under the weight of the psychic assault. They're inside my head. They're showing me the attic. They're showing me the dirt. I lunged for the second mirror. My boots slipped on the salt line we'd laid down, the white crystals scattering like bone dust. I swung the hammer with everything I had. The glass exploded. 2. The scream from the mall grew louder, a chorus of wooden groans and plastic snaps. The air was getting hotter, thick with the smell of scorched hair and old wax. I could see the mother now. Her eyes were rolling back, her jaw unhinging in a way no human jaw should. She was the anchor, and every mirror I broke was tearing her soul a little further away from the prime, or perhaps it was tearing her apart. I couldn't stop. I couldn't think about the cost. 3. 4. The mirrors were a network, a web of silver and shadow. With each strike, the prime mannequin became more animated, its movements losing their fluid grace and becoming frantic, jagged, like a broken film reel. It lunged at me, its fingers elongated into serrated points. I felt the wind of its strike whistle pass my ear, a cold, dead air that smelled like an open grave. I rolled, my shoulder hitting the damp concrete, the sledgehammer clattering beside me. The UV lights were strobing faster now, a frantic heartbeat of purple and black. In the flashes, I saw them, the horde. They were at the edge of the circle, hundreds of mannequins, their bodies overlapping, a wall of synthetic flesh pushing against the UV barrier Elena was fighting to maintain. Elena's light flickered. The battery was dying. The darkness began to bleed back in from the edges, and with the darkness came the whispers. They were using her mother's voice now, perfectly recreated, sobbing, begging for Elena to drop the light, to come home, to step into the circle. I scrambled for the hammer, my fingers slick with sweat and grime. I found the handle just as the prime pinned me. Its weight was impossible, like being crushed by a marble slab. Its face was inches from mine, and for the first time, I saw what was behind the porcelain. Not a void, but a teeming mass of translucent, worm-like filaments, all reaching for my eyes, for my mouth. Elena! I roared, the sound tearing my throat. The light. She didn't hesitate. She turned the floodlight away from the stairs, away from the swarm, and bathed the prime in a concentrated beam of high-intensity UV. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound, but a vibration that made my nose bleed and my vision go black at the edges. It recoiled, its artificial skin bubbling and charring under the violet glare. I didn't wait. I rolled to my feet, the hammer swinging in a desperate, wide arc. 5. 6. Only one left. The 7th mirror. It was the largest, the one directly behind the mother. It didn't show a reflection of the room. It showed the mall as it was 28 years ago, bright, clean, filled with people who didn't know they were walking through a slaughterhouse. And there, in the center of the glass, was the true Elena, the little girl who had lost her mother. The prime knew. It was using its final tether to manifest a lie so beautiful it could break us. The horde was breaking through. The mannequins were no longer freezing in the light. They were twitching, their collective will overriding the UV's paralysis. They were inches from Elena, their plastic fingers reaching for her jacket, her hair. "Elias, do it!" Elena screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of breaking glass and the roar of the entity. I looked at the final mirror. I saw the mother's face in the glass, her real face, young and full of life, reaching out as if to touch the surface. For a heartbeat, I hesitated. If I broke this, was I killing what was left of her? The Prime lunged one last time, a desperate, final surge of malice. It ignored the UV light, its body smoking and peeling as it flew toward me. I closed my eyes and swung. I didn't swing for the entity. I swung for the lie. The final mirror didn't just break, it vaporized. The sound was a physical blow that knocked me backward. A shockwave of cold air and white light exploded from the center of the circle, throwing the mannequins back like dried leaves in a gale. The screaming stopped. The whispers vanished. The oppressive weight on my chest evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence that was heavier than the noise had ever been. The UV lights died. We were plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I lay there, gasping for air, the taste of copper and dust thick in my lungs. My heart was a frantic drum against the floor. I reached out, my hand trembling, searching for the hammer, for Elena, for anything real. Elias. It was Elena's voice. Weak. Human. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, my fingers clumsy and numb. When the beam finally cut through the dark, it was narrow and shaky. I panted across the room. The mirrors were gone, reduced to a fine silver dust that coated everything. The mannequins, the hundreds of them that had been swarming the room, were piles of inert plastic, their limbs tangled, their glass eyes dull and lifeless. They looked like trash. Just trash. In the center of the room, Elena was cradling a figure on the floor. It was her mother. The skin was still pale, the body still impossibly thin, but the milk-white film was gone from her eyes. She was breathing. It was a shallow, rattling sound, the sound of a machine that had been turned off for a long time and was struggling to find its rhythm again. Elena was weeping, the tears carving clean tracks through the soot and salt on her face. We had won. We had broken the network. We had pulled a soul back from the throat of the void. But as I stood up, my joints popping, the adrenaline beginning to drain away into a cold, hollow ache, I looked at the piles of mannequins. In the periphery of my flashlight's beam, I could have sworn I saw a hand twitch. Just a fraction of an inch. A reflexive, phantom movement. I didn't tell Elena. I couldn't. We gathered the mother's fragile, broken body and began the long climb out of the dark. We left them all behind, the sirens of the extraction team finally wailing in the distance, cutting through the Oregon mist. I retired 3 days later. They didn't argue. They saw the look in my eyes, the way I flinched at my own reflection. I went home to a house I had spent 30 years making a fortress. I locked the doors. I closed the curtains. I lived in the quiet, or tried to, but the silence in my house felt different now. It felt like a held breath. A week ago, I unsealed the private safe in my study, the one where I keep my journals, the records of the things the FBI officially says don't exist. I opened my personal notebook to a blank page to write down the final entry, the closure I so desperately needed. But the page wasn't blank. There, in a jagged, shaky hand that looked like my own but felt like a mockery of it, were 6 words that turned my blood to slush. We are still here. We are still watching. I haven't slept since. I moved my bed to the center of the room. I covered every mirror with black cloth. I keep a flashlight in my hand at all times. Because now I know. The rules we followed in the mall, the salt, the UV, the tone generators, those were just to keep us busy. They were the rules for the things that move. But there is a final rule, a rule they don't teach you at the bureau. A rule that I realize now is the only one that matters. If you're walking through a room and you see a shapeshift in the corner of your eye, if you see a statue tilt its head just a hair's breadth when you look away, whatever you do, don't react. Don't gasp. Don't reach for a weapon. Because the moment they know you see them, they stop pretending to be wood and plastic. And once the mask comes off, there's no putting it back on. I can hear the clicking in the walls now. It sounds like porcelain on bone. And I'm out of mirrors to break. The cold air of the Oregon morning didn't feel like a liberation. It felt like a morning. As the mall receded into the rearview mirror, a jagged silhouette of concrete and consumerist rot, I felt a weight in my marrow that no amount of UV light could burn away. Beside me, Agent Elena Brooks sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. In the backseat lay her mother, Martha. We had pulled her from the heart of that porcelain hive, but looking at her through the mirror, I knew we hadn't brought all of her back. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the roof of the car with a terrifying, glassy intensity. She didn't breathe so much as she vibrated, a low-frequency hum emanating from her chest that sounded less like a human heartbeat and more like the distant drone of a dying television. The debriefing was a blur of fluorescent lights and men in suits who smelled of ozone and bureaucracy. They took Martha to a facility that didn't exist on any map, a place where the air is scrubbed and the walls are lined with lead. Elena didn't fight them. She stood in the hallway of the field office, her dark jacket torn and stained with the grey dust of pulverized mannequins, looking like a ghost haunting her own life. She had found her mother, yes, but the woman she held in the basement wasn't the woman who had tucked her in 28 years ago. That woman was a mosaic of shattered memories and mimetic static. When Martha finally spoke, her voice wasn't her own. It was a perfect, chilling echo of the tone generator we had used in the basement, a mechanical rhythmic pulse that made the nerves in my teeth ache. I handed in my badge 3 days later. My retirement was mandatory, a graceful exit offered to a man who had seen too much and knew where the bodies, both plastic and flesh, were buried. I took my pension and a box of memories I wished I could incinerate, and I drove until the sound of the ocean drowned out the clicking of my own thoughts. I bought a house on the coast, a place of salt-sprayed wood and heavy shutters. I thought the sea would be the cure. I thought the constant, rhythmic chaos of the waves would mask the unnatural stillness I had carried home from that mall. But the silence in the house was different. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was a presence. It was a thick, clotted thing that sat in the corners of the rooms, watching me. I spent my first weeks of retirement obsessively checking the perimeter. I installed high-intensity floodlights that turned the night into a harsh, artificial noon. I avoided mirrors. I covered the one in the hallway with a heavy velvet shroud, and I shattered the one in the bathroom, claiming it was an accident. The shards felt like jagged diamonds against my palms as I swept them away, but even in the broken pieces, I saw the distorted reflections of things that shouldn't be there. The existential terror began as a flicker, a movement in the periphery, a chair in the living room that seemed to have shifted an inch to the left while I was in the kitchen. I told myself it was the house settling. I told myself it was the trauma, the mind's way of processing the impossible geometry of the basement. But then came the phone call from Elena. Her voice was thin, brittle as old parchment. She told me Martha was fading. The doctors said her physical body was healthy, but her consciousness was like a radio station drifting in and out of range. Sometimes she would scream in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices overlapping. Other times, she would simply stand in the middle of her room, perfectly still, her posture mimicking the exact angle of the floor lamp beside her. Elena told me she found a mark on the back of Martha's neck. Not a scar, not a tattoo. It was a serial number, embossed directly into the skin, identical to the ones we saw on the prime's neck. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The entity hadn't just possessed her, it had begun the process of conversion. It was turning her into one of them from the inside out. That night, I couldn't sleep. The darkness in my bedroom felt heavy, like wet wool. I rose and walked to the small, wall-mounted safe I kept in my study. It was a heavy, steel beast, fireproof and bolted to the studs. Inside were my private journals, the true accounts of my years with the Bureau, and the only thing I truly trusted, my own handwriting. I spun the dial, the clicks echoing in the empty house like the snapping of dry twigs. The door swung open with a mournful groan. I reached for my notebook, the one I had used to record the final details of the mall assignment. My fingers brushed the leather cover, and a cold sweat broke across my brow. The safe was supposed to be a sanctuary. It was the one place where the world made sense, where the rules were absolute. But when I opened the notebook to the last entry, the ink was fresh. It was still tacky to the touch, smelling faintly of iron and rot. The words weren't mine. They were written in a cramped, jagged script that seemed to vibrate on the page. We are still here. We are still watching. The air in the room curdled. The mundane domestic light of my desk lamp began to flicker, the bulb humming with a frantic, dying energy. I backed away from the safe, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The shadows in the room began to stretch, lengthening toward me like grasping fingers. I realized then that I hadn't escaped the mall. The mall was a state of being, a parasitic dimension that followed you home in the folds of your clothes and the cracks of your soul. I looked toward the hallway, toward the velvet-covered mirror. The fabric was twitching. Something was behind it, pressing against the cloth, trying to find its way into the light. I heard it then, the sound I had been dreading. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sea. It was the clicking. A sharp, rhythmic sound of porcelain striking bone, coming from inside the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the very air around me. The lighting in the room began to fade, the shadows consuming the floor until only the small circle of my desk lamp remained. I realized the most terrifying unwritten rule of all, the one Dr. Vance hadn't lived long enough to record. The mannequins, the vessels, they don't just move when you aren't looking. They move when they think you've forgotten they're there. They wait for the moment your vigilance wavers, for the second you accept the mundane as reality. If you ever catch a mannequin moving in the corner of your eye, never let them know you see them. Don't react. Don't gasp. Don't reach for a weapon. Because the moment they know you see them, they stop pretending to be wood and plastic. And once the mask comes off, there's no putting it back on. The clicking is louder now. It's coming from the armchair in the corner, the one I thought was empty. I can see a hand, white and smooth as polished marble, gripping the edge of the fabric. It's not moving. It's waiting for me to acknowledge it. It's waiting for me to scream. But I won't. I'll sit here in the fading light, staring at the wall, pretending I don't see the way the shadows are taking shape. I'm out of mirrors to break, and the darkness is so very hungry. I can feel the static rising in my brain, the graininess of the world dissolving into the void. I am Agent Elias, and I am officially retired. But as the last of the light dies, I realize I'm not alone in my retirement. They are here. They have always been here. And they are finally ready to show me what's under the skin.